All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm here with my new friend, Heather Hamilton. I hope I can call you a friend. And we've only met very briefly. We both filled empty spots on a panel interviewing David Bentley Hart about his book, All Things Are Full of Gods, which is a dense, philosophical, beautiful thing that I haven't actually read. but I just love the premise of it, and I love the conclusions of it, and I'm aware of those things anyway. And so that was a great chat, and I reached out to Heather afterwards and said, hey, your book is called Returning to Eden. Is it Return to Eden or The Return to Eden?
It's Returning to Eden. Yeah.
Returning to Eden, yeah. And of course, this YouTube channel is called In Search of a New Eden. And so I thought, well, we should chat about what all
About
that
Eden.
means. Yeah, about Eden, exactly.
Yeah.
So if you want to introduce yourself and how you found your way to Eden, if you've ever have, or, all those sorts of
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah. So as you said, I'm Heather Hamilton. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And yeah, we got connected through filling in empty spots, which it's funny. I can't remember if we were recording or not, or maybe this was before we hit record. But how I sort of traversed my way into that conversation was I wrote this book, Returning to Eden. Here it is. And I reached out to David Bentley Hart about endorsing it. And it's funny because when I reached out to him, I basically said, career-wise, I have no business writing this book, you know. But I think it'll be worth your time. Would you like to read it? And to my complete surprise, he said yes, and then wrote this really lovely endorsement for the book, and shared it when it came out. Like it was just so generous and surprising. It was David, along with his brother Addison, who sort of blasted it out and really helped me on my launch day to get the word out. And so I'm still like very grateful for their generosity. But then I told David that the last time our paths kind of crossed was he was scheduled to be a podcast guest on another podcast called The Heretic Happy Hour, and he was going to be chatting with Rainn Wilson from The Office. Um, which I mean, probably everyone knows Rainn Wilson. I mean, I've seen every episode of The Office. And a couple days before that, David's dog died. His beloved dog, Roland, died. And I filled in that seat. So I ended up having this conversation with Rainn Wilson in place of David Bentley Hart.
as if.
And then I know, right, as if I could fill that.
Yeah.
But then that's sort of how I got onto this podcast with David finally, and got to talk to him in person for the first time. But it was because somebody else couldn't make it. So I just keep having all these last minute fill-ins that land me in these great conversations where I'm like, how am I here?
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know.
And I'm sure that was all part of your well thought out business plan, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. The first time I think in an emergency called my neighbors, like, could you please watch my kids? Like, I have to go talk to Rainn Wilson real quick, so pass them off. And then, in the conversation with David, like you said, All Things Are Full of Gods is such a dense book that I basically spent 2 days before that, like cramming for the conversation. So I would be grounded enough to actually have it. So it was funny, but I feel like it turned out really well.
Yeah,
So,
no, I had a great time for sure. I took the opposite approach where I was like, I know I can't cram this book, just especially I have ADHD and I just can't make myself read things. So I knew it wasn't going to happen. So I watched the Précy videos that had been sent over, and I just came up with some questions about metaphysics that I know has opinions on based on watching other talks from him, and just decided to use the chance to ask the master my questions.
yeah, yeah,
And, I'm glad I did, because I still have to go back and understand his explanation of how participatory knowing doesn't merge psychological selves but yet unites us. And I don't understand it yet, and so I'm gonna have to go back and watch it. But that was a question that I've often wrestled with, and he just sort of blurted out an answer that's going to take me 10 watches to even
Yeah,
comprehend.
digest.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, a little bit of background on me, I guess, is like I said, I'm from Atlanta. I grew up in the South in the Bible Belt. So we're on opposite ends of the continent almost. I have some family up in Canada, but I'm in the dirty South where it's where it's hot, and grew up in a very evangelical context. I don't know how much this will translate to you up north, but it was, you know, going to a program called Awanas where we'd go and, memorize Bible verses as a child and play games. And it was a really sweet program. I really enjoyed it. And then started going to church through that program, very like evangelical and Baptist churches, where they would have, like a church bus come pick me up on Sunday mornings, and we'd spend an hour or so picking up other kids and end up in Sunday school. And as I got older, we moved around a little bit. And so every time we would move, I just sort of had to find my youth group. And so that was always the context that was grounding me as we were moving and I was growing. And, in the South and evangelical spaces, the big push is to get people saved. So, I prayed the sinner's prayer when I was 7, and I sincerely meant that. I do remember that being a moment of really being drawn to the figure of Jesus. Even at that young age, I just felt a yes in my heart to the beauty of that. And then, attached to my yes was a lot of theological baggage, which your listeners are probably familiar with and can relate to. But it was a real sincere, I'm giving my life to this. I think by the time I was 12, I had promised God that I would be a missionary. It was like I had dedicated my whole future to a certain religious trajectory. And I remember even being in college, I started to get interested more in journalism and film and video production and more the arts. And I remember having such a conflict about this because I had told God, that I would be a missionary and go to Africa. And now I wanted to do filmmaking and video production. And, I just took it so seriously that I felt like I couldn't pivot. And I remember being at this big evangelical conference in Atlanta one year, probably 30 or 50,000 college students. Like it was one of these, huge mega conferences. And I remember the pastor there, Louis Giglio, talking about, you might have your journal or your devotion where you're writing your verses, but what are you drawing in the back of the journal? Are you doodling blue jeans? That's kind of tells you what your passion is. And he said, if you're doodling blue jeans, then go make blue jeans. And then you'll be able to witness and have influence with people who are in the blue jean industry. So it was almost like he was saying, you can go be a missionary. I can go be a missionary in video production space or in film studios or TV broadcast stuff. And so I felt like I had the permission to kind of pivot career-wise or whatever. So, but all that to say is I took all the commitments that I had made really seriously. And so throughout my 20s and 30s, I was involved at this really big evangelical megachurch. And after I had my third child at 32, this will be a little bit vague, but I ended up having it was conventionally called a nervous breakdown. I sort of had this eruption of past trauma that I hadn't dealt with. And it was sort of a flood of PTSD where I didn't have any context for what was happening to me. Like nothing like that had ever happened before. And it sort of erupted over the course of a few days.
It's all super relatable, just so you know.
Okay, good. Yeah, like I'm never sure how it's going to hit, where I'm just like, and then I had a nervous breakdown. But just my life was really, I mean, maybe I'm giving myself too much credit, but it just seemed like the picture of the sort of the perfect, like American Christian, did all the right things. And that's why, we're hashtag blessed, is because we followed the Lord. And then suddenly I was just like descending into this traumatic pit of panic and having like back to back to back to back panic attacks over the course of a few days that I really had no control over. Yeah. And so at this point, I had been in like talk therapy for probably, I don't know, 15 years or something. And I knew that what I was experiencing with the panic attacks and sort of the psychological descent, I knew that talk therapy couldn't help me. Like I didn't need to talk to anybody. Yeah. But I wasn't aware of any other resources that were out there. And so having just had a baby who was only about 10 weeks old, it was just this desperate exercise of trying to pull myself together, because I thought, if I ask for help, I'm going to be taken to a psychiatric facility. Like in my mind, I thought, I'm not aware of anything else that can help me. I don't know who to ask for help other than calling 911. And I think that that's just a ticket to, being separated from my kid. Yeah. And, maybe I would have considered that had I not had kids, and especially a new baby, but I was like nursing this baby. So I was really terrified to get separated from her. So anyway, I just kept trying to ride these things out. And one evening I say evening, it was probably 1 o'clock in the morning, down in my basement, trying not to wake the family up, just having, I don't know, just the most severe panic attack that I had ever had, and crying out to God to help me. And I just had this moment of feeling like my soul was just untethered out in space. Like I knew that whoever I was calling, like there was nobody on the other line. I just knew that nobody was coming to help me. And I had sort of this realization that maybe my whole life I had thought, if I'm ever in a situation like this, like God's going to come swoop in and save me. Right. And I don't think I was ever conscious of that until that's what I was asking for, and it was not happening. Yeah. And it was a moment of what I recognized as hell. Growing up as an evangelical, hell was eternal conscious torment after you die. And that's why you were saying the prayer. And that's, among other things, first and foremost, that was the reason why you were getting saved,
That's the best reason to pray I can think of.
Yeah, that's the best reason. And then of course, we attached a bunch of other stuff to it, and it's because we love God and we want to serve and we want to have the best life possible and blah, 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 blah. But we really don't want
hell. Definitely not hell.
Yeah, and we don't want our flesh.
The other deal is, I'll take it. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So, but I found myself there, and it was a recognition of, this is where I am. I I just knew that was where I was. And in that experience, the picture that came to my mind was Jonah and the whale. Like I knew that story, being in the belly of the whale, is where I was, and I understood, okay, this is where Jonah was. I wasn't breaking this all down intellectually like I am to you right now. Yeah. So I'll kind of get to that in a minute, but I felt like the biblical stories gave me a map as to where I was, whereas before, faith to me kind of meant this white-knuckled grip on these insane beliefs, like I have to believe that Jonah was literally in the belly of a whale for 3 days because God can do anything. And so, intellectually that didn't make any rational sense, but I thought that that's what faith was.
Right. The rejection of rationality is faith. Yeah,
Yes, thanks.
which
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
yeah, which is a terrible understanding of faith, and not a biblical one either, if you really get down to what the scriptures have in them. But anyway, go ahead.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. But that was the only framework that I had, and so that was that. But in this experience, I knew where I was on the map, if you will. And so a part of that was, I had never experienced any kind of suicidal ideation, but the panic attacks were akin to being in an emotional electric chair that I could not turn off. It wasn't I want to die. It was I can't live like this, and I do not know what to do.
Yeah.
And so we did call 911, which was basically for me was a moment of total surrender because I really thought that I was going to be separated from my kids. And so that's what I felt like I was surrendering to. When I opened the door, the person who was standing there started speaking, and I immediately recognized that this person was a transgender woman, which at the time, in my really conservative evangelical context in the South, it was just surprising to me. Like I was like, I wasn't expecting to encounter someone like this. So,
And she was a police officer as well?
she was an EMS worker.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like two women. And, when one of them started speaking, I was like, oh, this is a trans. So it was just sort of startling. It was sort of this moment of having expectations about what was about to happen. And suddenly it was like, okay, I'm like paying attention in some new way because I just wasn't expecting it. And so as she started speaking, it was the first time over the course of that whole experience that I felt like someone truly saw me and understood what I was going through. And so my first instinct in that moment was a little bit of fear and realizing that I didn't trust her because my orientation was I'm the Christian and I'm supposed to be helping people like you. That was constantly the disposition that I was taking
Right.
as a Christian.
So how could she come and help you right now? What is this?
Yeah. It was sort of this egoic thing where I didn't know how to receive help from someone where I had been taught my whole life that I had the truth and I had the answers for them.
Yeah.
Like it was like, oh, I
I can
can
see
give
that.
you
Yeah.
some help, but I don't know how to receive it. And so when I did start receiving, it was like a true receiving. My panic and fear, like time just sort of stopped and fell away. And I sort of felt like I was in this mystical bubble of her, like with her that felt like heavenly and real and just, I know it was like the most vivid moment of my life. And it felt like unconditional love. So I describe it in my book as like encountering Christ. Like what I was encountering was Christ in this very unexpected body. And so I recognized Christ in this woman. And I also felt it in me, like the same essential quality of aliveness and love that was coming off of her was also the deepest part of me, which felt like waking up from amnesia or something. Like it felt brand new and also completely familiar. Like this is the deepest part of me. This has always been here. This has always been embedded in me. I call it in the book, the true self or, my very essence. And so I recognize that as Christ. And so it was in her and it was in me. And sort of there was this communion. And so from there, actually, she, told me like, don't come with us, go see your therapist. And it just so happened that my therapist had just been trained in this new modality called EMDR, which is like a trauma-based therapy. And I was just able, it was exactly what I needed. And so I was able to work through all that PTSD and it, helped the panic attacks and everything. So it was just the moment that I asked for help, like the way just sort of opened up. But anyway, this whole experience of going from an evangelical Christian with very literal beliefs in all the biblical stories to going, I don't believe in hell like that anymore. And in fact, I've been there, and I and it had some lessons for me, and it transformed me, and now I'm back. And then I just encountered Jesus in this trans woman who, I've been conditioned to believe like doesn't understand understand Christ in the way that I do. I was just all it was very disorienting for me. And so as I was working through my personal psychology and sort of fixing the broken pipes in my head, as I was doing that psychological work, I began to experience my body and my reality in a different way. Like I felt different in my body. It was like I could feel my lifeblood flowing again. And so in my book, I sort of compare the psychology to water pipes and the spirit to the water flowing through there.
Perfect, because that's exactly what my New Eden thing's all about. So
awesome. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny that like the metaphors that come up, I'll encounter them, but there's just these symbols and archetypes and pictures and stuff that are just, floating around in the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung would say. And they come to you in these times to explain what's happening. And so, so I, the word deconstruction, I run into it all the time now. Mine, as I just described, it didn't start out as an intellectual pursuit. I wasn't interested in rethinking anything about my faith beliefs. I had actually connected all the dots well enough for me, and it all made sense to me. And then I just had this experience that exploded my framework of reality. But the experience was so real. The experience of hell was so real. The experience of Christ was so real that I had to figure out how to reinterpret my mother tongue in a way that would give language to what I had experienced. And so that was sort of the birth of the book. Where I live and where I was, for a while, I thought, I'm the only person. Maybe I'm the only person on earth that thinks this way. Like I didn't know anyone else who was looking at the text as mythology and symbolism and as maps to the inner world. I didn't know anyone who was interpreting it in a not literal way. And so I first and foremost wrote the book because I have 3 children. And I was thinking, if I'm ever not here, who is going to explain to them that this is how the Bible should be read? No one's ever explained this to me, so I better write a book that they can understand. I had read a lot of Jung, and I also got really into Joseph Campbell and started seeing a lot of parallels, in different mythologies and different religions. But I really wanted to open up the biblical texts for people who, can't make sense of the literal stories, or maybe had even dismissed the whole thing as just fairy tale or whatever, which, by the way, I mean, fairy tales are, infused with wisdom and symbolism. So maybe one day I'll write a book about fairy tales and why, Cinderella is absolutely like a real story in reality. But I felt like that the literature that was out there was it was very academic. It wasn't something that any of my friends or my neighbors or the people that I was interacting with they weren't gonna sit down and like read, memories, dreams, and reflections. I think that's the name of Carl Jung's memoir. They weren't gonna read him, and so I wanted to kind of bring those ideas down to earth and also, express the way that I was interpreting things as well. So, so that's really kind of how I set up the book, the concept of that true self and the false self, which is a little bit of it is sort of a dualistic concept, but it's so foreign to anyone who hasn't encountered it, that I almost felt like I need to start there to, to give some bones to this and make a distinction that there is something separate here. There is a self that you're asleep to, and you don't know that until to even look for it, right? And so, but I like the terms like ego and essence, things like that. So I sort of start off there and then really break down what the function of myth is, and then go through a lot of the popular biblical stories and kind of unpack how I find all of them to essentially, I know a lot of them are saying the same thing about, finding this pearl in the field or something like that, I mean, how do you even know that it's there unless someone tells you that it's there? And so kind of going through and describing how so many of these are metaphors and maps for how to find this, our essence or the Christ within or whatever, and how that can be born. And then the process of that. I write about hell a lot in the book, but I was writing a blog today where, an example that I love is a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. So today I was just writing about if you were to go and interview a butterfly and say like, how did you end up like so free and beautiful? The butterfly would say, well, I found myself melting in this dark cocoon and my entire sense of self and my old form just dissolving into goo. And then it's, transformed and and rebirths. And then I became this, And so the butterfly would essentially be describing hell, and it's this necessary stop on the journey. And I'm sure if we asked the butterfly, would you want to go do that again? It would probably say no, but was it necessary? Yes. And so we're really doing a disservice to people by either making hell this final destination, which we've come up with all sorts of imaginative ways to describe what that is, like a fantasy land of terror or something, but also to say like it's totally not real and it's nothing that you should ever worry about or be concerned with, because the truth is that at some point, whether it's during your life or on your deathbed or something, like you're gonna come to this stop on the journey, and it really helps to know that it's a stop on the journey and it's a transformational place. And, you're in the belly of the whale for 3 days, Jesus in the heart of the earth for 3 days. And so it's this place of surrender where essentially, okay, this is where you wait it out and you wait for God or fate or the universe, like however, whatever language you have for that, kind of surrendering your fate to it and letting it do what it will with you and trust that you're going to be spit out on the shore. If you don't know that, if you don't have that map, that's when things get really dangerous, where you panic, like I did the first time, people commit suicide. I mean, it is an impulse to die to self. And if you don't have the stories and if you don't have the picture, that impulse, people act out that impulse externally, And so I think that that's something I probably should have given it a trigger warning. But like what we're dealing with psychologically and spiritually, it's not just head knowledge, it's stuff that people will end up encountering, and that urge to die to self, that is a spiritual urge. It's holy and good. It's just the concept of dying before you die, or how do you let that part of the psyche die without killing the host? And so I think what we're dealing with a lot now in our society, with suicide rates going up and all sorts of the mental health crisis that we're in, is a lot of people have rightly, rejected the literalism of the Bible, rejected the sort of Zeus God in the sky concept that's damning everyone to hell. That's a proper atheism, I guess I would say. But with that, they've thrown the stories, in the
Yeah.
trash bin.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we're
yeah,
culturally lost. We're homeless, culturally homeless. I think
yeah,
that's why you see so many people searching other cultures. So many people interested in Hinduism, Buddhism, indigenous spirituality, all well intentioned and good, but just hungry for story, and not new stories, but old stories. Because new stories can become beautiful old stories one day if they're lucky and they're wise. But old stories have survived time and have been meaningful to generation after generation, and that means that they're at least more likely to be meaningful to you as well.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and I mean, thank you for sharing all that. I want to jump in on a million places, and I'm not sure exactly where to go with it. I mean, you're talking about the pipes. I mean, I 100% want to like deep dive on that with you,
Hmm.
because I don't know if you've read Eugena, but Eugena's got a whole system about the rivers of living water that sustain us and give life and the structure of our consciousness. And it all comes from scripture and Neoplatonic
Uh-huh.
metaphysics. But he does it in this beautiful symbolic way, which allows it to make sense. And and when I think of a symbol, I mean it as something that is like an interface with a spiritual reality.
Hmm.
And so for me, Eden is a symbol of human nature. And it's when we learn about Eden, we learn about ourselves. And if we are able to enter Eden spiritually, which is what lots of Orthodox teachers like Ephraim the Syrian and different folks in the Christian tradition will say is a thing that we do. We enter into the story. That what unfolds inside there is a symbolic representation of what is actually unfolding within our own spiritual nature, our own consciousness, our own soul, our own mind, whatever divisions
Yes.
and labels you want to give to it all. That
Yeah.
that when we tell the story of eating the fruit and when wondering why we're naked and all of these things, these are all real things that happen inside of us that we can participate in through the symbol. And so for
Yeah.
me, there's a quote from Saint Ephrem that I'm going to butcher. I should have had it ready, but he talks about reading the story, and he says that the lines lift him up, and his eyes remain outside of Eden, but his mind is transported to Eden through the book, and that the book, the scriptures, are a bridge and a gateway to Eden,
Hmm.
not the sacred object themselves, but rather
Right.
the entrance way to the sacred object, to
Yes.
the sacred space,
Yes.
to the
Yes.
interior, and perhaps exterior, depending. I'd love to talk about that space. And so that's kind of, it's hard for us in the modern world to wrap our minds around thinking of stories this way,
Hmm.
because we can do allegory, okay, where we can say, oh, that represents this, and that represents that, and therefore there's a moral teaching that I can take out of this and intellectualize. And that's an important level of reading. If you have the levels of reading scripture, which I think are really important, to have the literal level of what's just written on the page, like throwing the baby out with the bathwater would be denying the literal reading of scripture, even though it's the lowest level. And then above it, there's the moral in my mind, and then there's the natural, what is the nature of reality, and then there's the spiritual, the question of the soul, and it's being united with God. Um, yeah, I'm rambling now, but
Yeah. Well, I just as you were kind of making that distinction, I'll just throw in a little example from my own life. I read a really fabulous book one time. It was about Cinderella, and it was about I already kind of mentioned her. You could tell I'm like thinking about Cinderella. Um, it and it was such an enlightening book. It was written by a psychotherapist, and it was all about the psychology and the symbolism of this fairy tale, and really how the fairy tale was a big theme in it was envy. And so you have, Cinderella, which she possesses like an intrinsic goodness in her. She's naive. She's a naive girl, but there's something intrinsically good and beautiful, not just externally. She is a beautiful character, but you can tell that her heart is pure. Um, and the the stepmother and the stepsisters are envious of this. But envy is such a intolerable emotion for us to admit that we're experiencing,
Hmm.
that instead of instead of being instead of saying something like I'm envious of, the beauty in your soul or your goodness or whatever, it's like this constant tearing down and gaslighting, so that the aggression isn't it's not so direct. It's a passive aggressiveness, that sort of tricks Cinderella into thinking like, what's wrong with me? You know, it's it's a it's the envious saying, how can we get this person to destroy themselves, to erase themselves, so that we can have clean hands about it? And so when I realized that this is this was the dynamic of the story, I was like, oh my gosh, Cinderella is all of a sudden much more interesting to me now. But something what this author, the book was called Cinderella and Her Sisters, and I can't remember the author's name right now, but something that she describes is that when people are on the receiving end of envy, it's a very intolerable feeling. Like if you can think of it as like a laser, like cutting through you or something, you want to erase yourself. And so there's the natural instinct is to be small, to not be too like, look at me or anything like that, because anything that you do, if someone's envious of you, you want to shrink so that you can get yourself out of that sort of I don't know, like deadly laser beam. And
Hmm.
so we see Cinderella doing this, like self erasure, trying to do everything perfectly, and then a real, uh, and is it good enough? Am I good enough? It's not good enough. I don't understand why, So she's actually sort of confused and self critical, not really able to see that the problem is the other people and not her. And the turning point of the story is when she finally puts her foot in the slipper, which this was a powerful moment in reading this book to me, because if you imagine putting your foot into a shoe that fits, it's like there's like an energetic like, this is for me, it
Hmm.
locks in.
Yeah,
So
there's a
so
satisfaction to it, a certain comfort. Yeah.
yes. And so in
Hmm.
the story, you see, the stepsisters. I think in Grimm's fairy tale, maybe even they cut their toes off or something, trying to jam their feet into the slipper that doesn't fit. Like they're
Hmm.
trying to steal a future for themselves that isn't theirs. And so we can all feel that too, where, I'm trying to bend and I'm trying to cram myself into somebody else's life or someone else's future or someone else's opportunity that doesn't belong to me. Um, but for the one who's envied, which I'm not saying that was envied, but where this comes to my life is after I had written this book, I didn't yet have a publisher. And I remember when uh, Choir, which published my book, said yes, they would do it, I was really surprised that I felt like depressed and
Hmm.
anxious and scared. Like I wasn't excited about it at first,
Right.
because like I had really put my heart and soul and everything into this, and I knew I'm like I'm gonna have to come out. I'm gonna have to talk about this confidently, and I'm gonna have to tell people you should read this book, you should buy this book. I'm gonna have to do all these things that I feel really uncomfortable with, and I don't want to. I sort of had this complex of like I don't want to stand up and be like, look at me. Like that felt very uncomfortable to me. And so having someone say, yes, we're going to publish your book, which means this is actually going to happen, I really struggled for several weeks of just like how criticism or pushback, or what if I say the wrong thing? What if I offend someone? I mean, we're still sort of in cancel culture, but it just felt really hot at that time. And so I really wasn't excited about it. And it was that picture of putting my foot in the slipper and saying, yes, it's a yes to your future. that really helped me. Like it helped me energetically to get over the threshold of resistance. Sorry, threshold of resistance that I was experiencing.
Hmm.
And so all that to say is going back to the stories in the literal reading, like it's it's the details of the story are important, right? Like it matters that it is a glass sparkly slipper. You know, it matters that she becomes a princess when she puts her foot into it. You know, did she really become like did this historically happen? No. But is the significance of, you know, a soul becoming royalty like that's important because there's a certain value that you then recognize in your own soul about, you know, how I should be treated, how I should look at myself. And it's not a haughty like, oh, I'm a Disney princess now. It's that I have intrinsic worth of, you know, value, which is equal to, you know, to Christ essentially. And so when you understand that that's the purpose of the stories and the fairy tales and all these things, like it is transformative to the soul and to the psyche. And so as you said, there's like that basic level. When we say literal, we're not necessarily talking about historical, which sometimes it is, but the pictures that stick in our mind, they're not arbitrary. They are important.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
like it's important that when I was in hell, that a picture of the belly of a whale came to mind. You know, on the surface, that's an absurd story to make up. When it came to the significance of it, that it was important specifically that that was the picture that I had.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I love the way you've unpacked Cinderella. I've never thought of that story in such detail, and I want to read the Grimm's version now, which I think I have on my shelf somewhere. I think I have all the
Mm-hmm.
stuff they've written, because I'm a nerd and build libraries for fun. Well, build a library for fun. I wish I could build libraries per Laurel, but I'm working on one small library. Um, but I love the way you describe the dynamic of the sister's oppression of Cinderella, which isn't something I had considered before. I'd always thought of it as just sort of like a generic plot thing that like her life sucked and then it got better and that's the
Mm-hmm.
story kind of thing. But when you think about the dynamic, the family dynamics inherent in there with the stepmother and the stepsisters, and their scapegoating of
Yeah.
Cinderella, of using her as a lightning rod for all of their dysfunction and chaos, and her taking it on and not knowing that
Absorbing it.
it's hers and not knowing that it's wrong. And I think that that's, I mean, it's striking home for me because I didn't share my story, but I also went through hell, which involved a nervous breakdown and a lot of PTSD, and I have a long story of homelessness and dysfunction, and I was kidnapped and placed into this weird cult school called Provo Canyon School in Utah,
Mm.
which I am just on the other side of my breakdown. I mean, it's slowly ending over the last couple of years.
Is Provo Canyon School the school that I think Paris Hilton did the documentary about?
Yeah, it actually is. I had no idea. I've never met her, but we went to the same school, and I had no idea
Mm.
until someone sent me a message one day and said, "Oh my God, Paris Hilton went to Provo Canyon School." And I thought, "What?" And I watched the video, and
Hmm.
it's the same old PCS for sure. So that's the place I was there, and a couple other places, and I have severe flashbacks, and there's a lot of severe trauma that I won't discuss because I'll have a flashback and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. But I'm grounded enough to say that much about it now, and it was quite the process, and it was certainly hell. And part of coming out of that for me has been realizing that the people around me weren't providing the same kind of support that I thought they were. And
Hmm.
I didn't know that, and it's not even like I chose to ignore it or something. I just didn't understand. And I think when
Yeah.
you were describing Cinderella, it resonated for me. Like I found myself in Cinderella's shoes, so
Hmm.
to speak, occupying her place and realizing this moment of the fairy godmother or the slipper that fits or whatever the moment of shift is, that wait a minute, this isn't just a normal dynamic and you're a crappy person.
Mhm.
That actually there's like a whole other potential out there and you have a beautiful thing that can be realized and recognized. And I think the image of royalty, it's important that you also pointed out that that's like a good thing, because I think in our
Yeah.
culture we want to imagine like, oh, okay, so now she's joined the bourgeoisie, like great, good for her, you know.
Yes. Yes.
and,
Yes.
and
Or
there's
the
part of me that wants to be like, screw the prince, you know,
right,
or
right.
the
Yeah.
patriarchy and all of the what all that represents and stuff. But at the same time, if you accept the story where it is from its own terms, royalty is clearly a symbol of goodness, of becoming something
Hmm.
more than you were before. Even though I reject the notion of royalty being more, the image and the symbol is still of that, and that there's some kind
Yeah.
of fittedness with the jewel of great price, the pearl in the field, the shining slipper. And if your soul fits it, then you can leave behind all the lies that you've lived in and learn something new. And that,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing
Exactly.
that. That meant a lot to me. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just, I mean, you described it beautifully. It's the future that is meant specifically for you and that your soul fits. But you can imagine, and it sounds like maybe you've experienced this, like stepping into those things, like, oh, I think I want to do this, and hearing those voices, like real or imagined, of the stepsisters or the stepmother. Exactly. So, like, who do you think that you are? Who do you think
Yeah.
you are? A Disney princess, like, and making the soul's true desire into a feeling of entitlement or feeling selfish or grandiose or something like that. And so there's this self erasure that happens, which is, I mean, is really deadly. Like that goes as far as, one, like self erasure can go all the way
Yeah.
to killing oneself. And so that is the that is certainly, um, I'm not sure how much that theme shows up for everybody, but certainly for very sensitive or empathetic people who genuinely want connection and, kind of move through life with goodwill, sincere, good faith efforts to connect and um, end up in situations or relationships where they feel utterly confused as to what went wrong. Um, that, yeah, Cinderella and Her Sister is the name of the book. It was a very illuminating book, and showed me the power of fairy tale. That's just one, but there's so many. I don't know if you ever listened to Jonathan Pageau. He talks about symbolism and fairy tales quite a bit,
Yeah, I've
and
listened to
he's
him a
got
little bit, not a whole lot.
uh huh
We differ on a lot of theological and social points.
uh-huh
But he introduced me to Saint Ephrem the Syrian, which I'll be forever grateful for, in his video on the symbolism of Eden,
mm-hmm
and Ephrem's hymns on paradise, which are just so good.
mm-hmm
And I'd love to chat with him sometime about the symbolism in Eden and Ephrem and all that. I don't know if you've encountered Ephrem or anything. It sounds like you more
I
intuited a
I
lot of
haven't.
this stuff. Like you didn't read the church fathers who did all the work before you, kind of thing.
I know
Yeah,
that
yeah.
came after. I have read some now, but it all came after. I don't even think, I mean, this is going to sound so silly to you, but it's true. I don't even think I knew that there were church fathers like before this. I mean, I was so Protestant evangelical. Like we don't learn about any of them. It's Jesus. It's barely Mary. It's Jesus, Paul, some disciples. We learned basic like Noah's Ark, Jonah and the whale kind of thing. But there was no early church history. There was no church fathers. And so, yeah, I intuited a lot. And then when I started reading them, it was comforting to me. I think St. John of the Cross was the first time I had heard the Dark Night of the Soul, like someone name that. Um, so it was comforting to realize, oh my gosh, there's people in the Christian tradition who are naming my experience. I can trust this because I haven't come across this anywhere else. Um, yeah, but I loved what to go back to what you were saying about Eden, and how that became sort of a map or picture for the natural stages of human development for our evolution of consciousness.
Mm.
Um,
Yes, ma'am.
I, yeah. I realized that as well. When I went back and read through the story, I noticed that in the story, it says that God put Adam to sleep, and it never says that he woke him up. And that is really how that was my experience of being on the porch with the transgender woman, was feeling like I woke up to my soul, which had gone to sleep. And so to see that reflected in the story really eliminated a lot of guilt and shame that I had felt about original sin or mistakes that I had made, because then I realized that all of it had happened in a state of sleep. It was like waking up from a dream, you know? And so it's not like that there weren't things to go back and make amends and try to correct. I just I understood that I had my consciousness had fallen asleep in the garden. And even, the eating of the apple, which was the catalyst for leaving the garden, I understood that to be a healthy part of human development, is having to leave and go on the journey so that you can re-enter and see it with new eyes. I think that it
The prodigal
runs
son.
exactly. Oh my gosh, Justin, that is exactly what I was about to say. Is, by the end of the story, you have the picture of the father, the prodigal son, and the other brother. They're all with the father, but one brother is experiencing that communion with the father as heaven, and the other brother is experiencing it as hell. They're all in the same place, they're all in Eden with the father, but the experiences are different. And so, in my growing up, it was don't be the prodigal son, don't leave. But it's actually the prodigal son that fulfills his destiny
Mm-hmm.
by leaving completely and coming back home, like returning to Eden, coming back to the same place which he left, but he can receive all the abundance that was always there, whereas the other brother who never left can't. So that's so funny. That's exactly what I was about to say. Was it's the same story.
Yeah. No, I love that for sure. Ari Ugina has this idea, and he wasn't the first, but he's the one I've read it in, so I'll just talk about him. But that Eden is a story that got interrupted at the beginning. And so the fall interrupted the unfolding of the garden and the story.
Mm.
And when we return to Eden, the story actually begins, which is something that I really like, because in the whole notion of sort of returning to Eden, there's, for me, a sticky point that could be kind of this imagining, like just going back to some kind of static utopic thing that
Mm-hmm.
feels really sort of robotic and unappealing to me, this sort of state of unchanging perfection, which isn't really what I am attracted to. But in the symbolic reading of Eden through many of the old writers, there's this idea again that, well, once we return to Eden, which is the purpose of it all, which is the prodigal son, which some say, Ephraim says that the sword that pierced the side of Christ, is the same sword that guarded Eden, and now that it's
Mm.
pierced Christ, it's no longer flaming, and we can once again enter, and then begin our journey, begin to become what we were meant to become. And so that is a whole different idea than original sin. It's this
Mm-hmm.
it's this concept that whether or not it was meant to be that we left the garden, it's just what is, and in some sense, for me, that means it's meant to be. And and I think there's room for the Felix culpa, for the blessed wound, for the
Hmm.
the resurrection isn't the only part of the story. You know, we celebrate Good Friday just like we celebrate Easter Sunday, even though Easter Sunday's better. But
Right.
Good Friday is still important. And yeah, you know, we need to fall, I think, sometimes away in order to come back and appreciate what we have and to see
Hmm.
it in a new light. There's that famous poet whose name I can't remember who says, you know, and at the end of it all, we came around to where we were at the beginning, but we see it in a
Hmm.
new way and we understand it in a new way. And I think that there's something about that that we can return to Eden. And if Eden is a symbol of human nature, then, you know, as Ariugena points out, the fall away from Eden is a fall away from ourselves. It's to live
Hmm.
and to grow outside of ourselves, exiled from ourselves in the desert, trying to survive in this wilderness,
Hmm.
and trying to grow and flourish the way we were meant to, but we're doing it in the wrong environment now. We're outside of ourselves. We're in this ugly, difficult, barren place.
I just had a revelation when you said that.
Okay, go.
Yes. Okay, so Eden being a symbol of the self, and then to leave Eden is to fall away from that, to go into the desert and all that. It's interesting that externally, as how do I say this? Like externally, societally, like we're accepted as we internally fall away from ourselves. So it's like we enter into this internal desert, but externally all looks well. And then for me, at least, when I came back to Eden, I felt like I had recovered myself. As you said, it was like I feel like I woke up and my life is just starting. I feel alive. But externally, I was experiencing the desert. Like I felt alienated from
Yeah.
from church, and you know, even being able to communicate with anyone. I hear a lot of people talk about feeling like they're in the wilderness and they're in the desert, but then it's just it's interesting to me that you know, when the scripture talks about like the letter of the law brings death, but the spirit of the law brings life, where there is this um, like flip flopping of the internal reality and the external reality, and in order to pursue like the inner spiritual journey, externally you end up with sort of the opposite situation, right?
Yeah, for sure. I was trying to pull up a quote, but it's too hard. Yes, and I think, I mean, that isn't that what Jesus taught, right? That the seed is
Mm-hmm.
going to die and it's going to be reborn and all of
Yeah,
the
I
stuff,
brought a
just like the
prop.
butterfly. Oh, the acorn.
Yeah,
There you go.
I have a seed. Yeah, because yeah, I use this. Oh, I have a chapter called a sort of like the anatomy of a seed, but it's really about having grace for the shell, which would represent our false selves or our ego, or the protective layer that we had to form naturally to weather the environment, right? So in the garden, the fruit that grows, it actually grows as an embryo on the tree. And so it's the little green piece. And I kind of like to think about that as the soul or the true self or my essence. But if that soul or true self essence were to fall off the tree without this protective shell, it would just get washed away, you know? Like it has to form, you know, on this acorn specifically, there has to be this hard protected shell to protect that inner self. And then it falls off, you know, and then you are disconnected from the tree of life and you're rolling around through the elements. And it's not until this acorn finds a favorable spot to get buried, go into the dirt, and then crack open. You know, that cracking open and the falling away of the shell is the dying to the self. You're sacrificing this outer layer so that the embryo can then take root and you grow into a marvelous tree. And as Paul says, it's crazy. Like when you wake up to this and then you go read the text, I'm like, this is how Paul describes resurrection,
Yeah.
is like a tomato plant or whatever. You know, like you would never guess that inside of this acorn shell is is an oak tree. Like that's its potential, right?
Hmm.
But yeah, the mistake that we make, which I think it's inevitable. This has helped me move past so much anger at ignorance. It's really what it is, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand that this is inevitable, but we all end up identifying completely with just this little shell. I'm just a little acorn. This is who I am. This is what I look like. And then when life pulls us down into the ground, into the heart of the earth, and this breaks open, and suddenly we're without all of our attachments and everything that we've identified as. I mean, that it feels like you're dying, right? So, so that's why the stories are so important because if you don't know that there is an embryo underneath this and that this dying has to happen and you have to hold on for long enough for the roots to take hold, that's when it gets real scary. Um, it sounds like you've experienced that some, but yeah, having my experience and then seeing this process, in the story of the Garden of Eden it was so helpful to me to forgive myself, to forgive everybody else, realizing, oh, this isn't just what happened with me. This is what is happening with everybody.
Hmm.
Everyone, before they wake up to this reality, is just operating the best they can in their little hard shells.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great metaphor for sure. Or symbol. I'm trying to decide between two symbols, whether I want to talk about the rivers in Eden or whether I want to talk about the tree of prayer from the cloud of unknowing, and I can't decide.
I'm bad
Um,
at mixing metaphors. I'll,
yeah,
I'll,
you pick. Do you
I'll,
want the tree of prayer or do you want the rivers of living water?
let's go with the rivers.
Okay, cool. That's a deeper dive. So, Ariugena, when he talks about Eden as a symbol of human nature, he points out that in Genesis 2, there's this sort of obscure little passage that most people pass over where it says there's a spring that comes up in the garden and divides into four rivers, and they have names. There's the Pishon and the Gishon, and I can't remember them all, the Euphrates, and they each have a stone or whatever. And those are traditionally associated with the four directions, north, east,
Hmm.
south, west. But what Ariugena says is he takes this scripture passage and then he compares it to Jesus later in the Gospel of John, saying that rivers of living water will flow out of the heart of the believer, and that these are the Holy Spirit. These rivers of living water are actually the Holy Spirit. And so he says the heart of the believer is human nature, which means he's talking about Eden, which means he's talking about this spring, which is where
Hmm.
the rivers of living water come out. And so he develops this entire sort of symbolic landscape wherein in the heart of the human being, in the heart of our nature, comes up a single point of the Holy Spirit, which divides and becomes like going through like light through a prism. The one becomes many. And he says those four rivers then continue to divide and branch off into all these rivulets so that the Holy Spirit can flow through our nature, irrigating and rejuvenating the garden of our being and giving us life and vitality and verdancy. And that these rivers flow out, and then once they've reached the end of our nature, they return back into the single source from which they came, and there's an ebb and a tide from the one to the many of the
Mm.
singleness of the Holy Spirit at the center of the garden, and the multiplicity of the rivers. And all of these rivers are virtues, and for him also angels, and that these rivers exist also in the macrocosm in the larger world. And a virtue and an angel are the same thing. And so the four rivers, he says, are the four cardinal virtues, which in Christian tradition are prudence, temperance, justice, and courage or fortitude, which comes through just the Western tradition in general. But then it divides to form all the other virtues. And so this is where the source of all the virtue and all the goodness and all the beauty of a soul comes from, is from here. But I think, if that spring gets covered up and gets filled with junk, then the rivers don't flow properly, and our virtues aren't as evenly distributed, and we become out of balance. And so in my own prayer life, like when I go into Eden in my mind and my heart, I will sometimes go to that spring with my mind's eye, and I'll actually just start ripping out old rotten leaves and logs and junk that's there,
Mhm.
to make sure that the rivers are flowing in my soul. Yeah, that
Yeah,
was
I
the thing I
like that.
wanted to say. Does that tie into your pipes? You said
Oh,
something about
absolutely.
pipes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I think what yeah, what you're getting at or what you were just describing and what I was thinking of is that when the rivers are blocked, um I think we sometimes forget that it the water is just as powerful whether it's flowing freely or whether it's blocked. It's still the same water that's flowing. And so the potential for the negative consequences builds and builds and builds and builds. So, if we think of that water as the Holy Spirit and there is blocks, it's like dammed up or whatever, eventually, or in your house, if there's a block in your pipes, eventually there's going to be leakage.
Mhm.
And if you don't pay attention to that, then eventually your pipes are going to explode. And then it's flood and chaos and destruction everywhere. And so, yeah, I was thinking, like when we talk about the Holy Spirit, I think a lot of times we think of it very sweetly, um, and understanding that actually there's also potential for for fire and water to rain down and to wipe out everything. Um, so yeah, that's I loved the picture that you had of clearing stuff out, so that it can flow properly. Um, but yeah, that's again, it really helped me with the guilt and shame that I felt about what I might have called sin or something, um, previously, because I just understood, oh, there was a block in the pipes or there was a block in the river or something, and so the water was redirecting in some other way. Uh, so that's interesting. This is just like a funny story, but that virtue of courage. Um, I've had different points in my life where I'll just tell you this silly story. When I was in high school, I think I was probably 17 or something. I had a friend who lived on the lake. And so we would go, bum off his boat or whatever and ride around. And there was one day where over the lake, there was this really high bridge where there was like a 2-lane highway going across the bridge.
Mhm.
And a couple of my friends were like, we should go like climb up these rocks and jump off the bridge. And so I didn't actually want to do this, but I don't know why I agreed to do this. But so I climb up the rocks, and as I'm running down this highway, like I'm in my bathing suit while cars are just passing. So it's like dumb teenagers. I felt embarrassed, like I got to get off this bridge as soon as possible. And like I remember that was the motivation for me jumping off this bridge. Like when parents say, if your friends ever tell you to jump off your bridge, would you do it? And I'm like, apparently I would do it because I did
Only
it.
if they told me to.
Yes, only if they told me to would I jump off a bridge. And I was like a really smart kid. This was out of character for me, but I just like I laugh at that. I'm like I would do it. Um but my motivation for doing it was I'm like embarrassed about the drivers in the car like looking at me or judging me or something. Like that was, I mean, and that's like a really egoic thing. Like that was like a sort of a part of it's a vice, right? Like, oh, I care about how much people think of me so much that that's going to be the motivation for me to jump off this bridge.
Yeah, the church
But I,
fathers would call it the vice of vainglory. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. But I remember the it actually did take courage. It took courage to leap off the bridge. Like
Yeah.
a lot of things that I've done in my life that have felt like I've used my courage positively, I can look back on that moment and go, it was the same thing. Like I had to push against the same fear and push through it in order to do it.
Mhm.
And so um, that virtue of courage it was actually there in that moment. It was misdirected. And I literally I jumped off the bridge And I didn't think at all about how I would enter the water, which it was very high up. And so you should enter the water as like a pencil straight going down so that you cut through. But I was like in a sitting position. And so when I hit the water, like I can still hear the pop on the water. And I couldn't move my legs. And all my friends had thought that I had broken my legs or maybe I was dead. And so I just sort of floated up to the top, screaming and moaning, and they had to pull me onto the boat. And then immediately, like my legs were bruised immediately. And so when we got back, then it was me like wrapping in a towel so that our friend's mom didn't see my legs so that she wouldn't be like, what, what did y'all do? So, I mean, literally could have died because of this vice of vainglory and this stupidity. But actually, it was it was also like this exercise in courage. So I don't know. That's like a very silly example, but it's showing you that like the power in it. I've had to draw on that same like powerful part of myself, but just how it can either go for something so beautiful and moving and inspirational, or you can kill yourself jumping off a bridge.
Yeah.
So, but the potential is like still there. It's the
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah, no, that's a really good observation, and it matches the tradition perfectly. The four cardinal virtues, and the word cardinal just means it's like the hinge of a door in Latin. So it's like that upon which everything else hinges. They're also called the practical virtues, and the practical virtues are taught before the spiritual or the theological virtues. And the idea is that the practical virtues are not Christian. They are for anybody. They are secular virtues, which are necessary and helpful in the religious life and in everything that we do. So in business and family and legalities and whatever, we need the cardinal virtues. And they are sort of moralists in a sense. I mean, there's one of justice, which sounds ethical, but I mean, there can be a justice system that's unethical. And they they are practical virtues that allow us to do things. And so courage, like you say, I mean, it can lead you to do something clever and important. It can be the thing that breaks Cinderella from her sister's spell, the courage to do that. And that's like so beautiful and so important. And it can also be what allows a soldier to run out into battle and kill a child on accident or whatever, who knows, right? Like, but the reason Ariadne likes to say the first four are the practical virtues is because we need to cultivate those before any other virtue is of value to us. So if we try and cultivate humility, but we don't know anything about courage or justice or any of these, the other two are prudence and temperance. So if we try and practice humility without prudence, we don't have a good sense of what's practical and what's going to work and what's going to be effective. We can end up just hurting ourselves and smushing ourselves and destroying ourselves. And we need prudence before we try and practice humility to know, okay, this is actual humility and this is just like self-deprecation and nonsense.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I like that contrast. Going back to Cinderella just real quick, because we've already
Yeah,
made
I
that
do
a
have to
theme
wrap
of
up
this.
soon, but I want to hear what you have to say about Cinderella. We'll have to do a round two.
Well, I was just gonna say that humility confused with self-deprecation or self-erasure, and then you see the shift into she develops true humility in the end, whereas like this is my life, this is my purpose, and I'm going to use it for good, but this is who I am. And I can't remember which version of this it is, but she actually sends like fresh strawberries from the palace or from the kingdom to her stepsisters, but it's done anonymously because she knows if I deliver the gifts, then they won't be able to accept them from me, but I still want to bless you. And so, it's like an anonymous gift
Like
of strawberries.
Bodhisattva moment or something.
Yeah. But you can see that principle or whatever of humility manifesting as self-erasure, self-deprecation in the beginning, and then the transformation into royalty or whatever is like a fruit of the spirit kind of virtue. So yeah, I love that you illustrated that. You should write a book on the virtues. You're very good at explaining them and the different levels.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that I'd love to talk to you about the book I've been working on for a couple of years and haven't finished yet, but is like almost there, and is an
Yeah.
entire book about what I was just talking about, the symbolism of Eden and how to go back and all of these church fathers, and a whole bunch more detail and a whole bunch. I write really densely and it's pretty long. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
so the answer is yes. The book is, in theory, could be done in a couple of months if I had a life that allowed me to spend a couple months finishing it. But
Yeah. Well,
I'm
please finish it.
waiting for that window to appear. But
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank
yeah,
you, Justin.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Okay,
Heather.
I'll plug mine real quick.
Yes,
Returning to
please do.
Eden by Heather Hamilton. Oh, I can't get in the
Yeah,
frame, but there it is. And I
and
also have
we'll
a
definitely
poetry
put a
book
link to
coming.
it in the description and everything on YouTube, so
Yeah.
everybody can find it real easy that way as well. But what else were
Cool.
you gonna
Yeah.
say?
I have a poetry collection called Eat the Dirt, 52 Poems on God and Being Human, and that's going to release on September 17th of 2025.
Oh,
So
that's awesome.
soon.
Well,
Yeah.
we'll have to talk poetry sometime. I write poetry. I actually wrote poems slash hymns for each of the cardinal virtues, and also six
I would
spiritual
love to read
virtues
those.
that came
Oh
to
my
me
gosh.
like in a download during the deepest of my hell experience. And
Yes, downloads. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, somehow Saint Bridget was there, and also Protege, who's like a reggae artist that I really love, and it was all very convoluted. And these really precise songs came to me, and they're like perfectly set to hymns, traditional hymn tunes like Ash Grove and stuff that you'd all know. And yeah, but anyway, we'll
Yeah.
have to, if you're into it, we'll do another chat sometime. But
Yeah, that'd be
take
great.
care, and
Thanks, Justin.
every blessing to you and yours.